Some stories don't arrive with thunder. They seep in, like the chill before a storm, quiet and bone deep. At A1 Storyteller, we do not chase the loudest tales. We uncover the ones buried beneath the noise, the ones you carry in your chest long after the screen fades to black. This story doesn't begin with gunshots or sirens. It begins with a silence so thick it tastes like rusted iron. A silence broken not by violence, but by something colder, indifferent. And from that silence rises a woman. Not a hero by design, not an activist by title, but a mother, a therapist, a woman who had stitched together a life with her bare hands and chosen, again and again, to let her grace speak louder than her grief. But grace, in this town, was invisible, her presence too quiet for the powerful to notice, until one morning, when power, he mistook silence for weakness, and cruelty mistook stillness for submission. In the flicker between humiliation and justice, between a steaming cup and the woman it burned, an old truth was reborn. The world breaks the quiet ones until they rise, not with fury, but with unshakable presence. This is not just a story of what happened, it is a story of what we often overlook, of what we silence until it screams, and in telling it, we ask only one thing: feel everything. Because if you do, this story might just rearrange the furniture in your soul. The town of Millfield was the kind of place where everything appeared to be in its place. Lawns trimmed, doors unlocked, faces polite. But beneath the postcards and porch lights, there lingered a fatigue, ancient and sour, the kind born from generations of whispered bigotry, passed down like family heirlooms. And it was on one of those seemingly peaceful mornings that Lorna James walked into Rosie's diner, wrapped in her wool coat and soft silence, seeking nothing more than warmth and a moment to herself. She chose the corner booth, always the corner, because it gave her room to breathe without being seen. Her gloved hands folded around a ceramic mug, untouched. Her eyes gazed out the window, seeing far beyond the glass, to memories not worth remembering. Nobody in that diner knew who she was. Not the teenagers slouched over greasy plates, not the waitress with the tired smile, and certainly not the man who would soon decide that her dignity was his to spill. There was something about her stillness that unnerved people, something about the way she occupied space without apology. In a town used to quiet black, women knowing their place, Lorna's silence was too loud, and while she said nothing, the room watched her. Perhaps they didn't know why, but they did, because somewhere, deep down, even those who pretended not to see her could feel it. This woman had survived things they couldn't pronounce. And in her quiet presence, they mistook restraint for invisibility. Until, of course, they didn't. The bell above the diner door jangled with a lazy, indifferent chime. Sheriff Matt Hanlon stepped inside, his boots thudding heavy against the linoleum, the weight of his authority pressing down on every table he passed. He didn't wear his badge like a job. It clung to him like a crown. And Millfield, this brittle little town hiding its rust under white paint and plastic smiles, bowed to it without question. Matt had that kind of face, sun-art dead-end, stone-carved, with a smirk that had twisted into habit. His presence turned the air colder even as the morning sun poured through the windows. He greeted no one because he didn't need to. Respect here was never earned. It was inherited, passed down like the color of his eyes or the rifle over his father's mantle. He made a beeline toward the counter, nodding at the waitress who poured his coffee with trembling hands. He liked his mornings quiet, with something or someone beneath him. And then he saw her, Lorna James, black, alone, composed, Something about the way she sat in that booth set his teeth on edge. Not defiant, not loud, but unbothered. Her silence didn't flatter him. It didn't shrink for him. That disturbed Matt more than words ever could. He didn't know her name, didn't care to. All he saw was a woman not playing the part, not flinching, not looking down. Looking down. In his world, quiet was submission. But this was something else. And that something scraped at the hollow place inside him, where conscience used to live. So he decided to punish her for it. Without thought, without hesitation, just muscle memory and old poison. He turned slowly, holding the fresh cup of coffee like a chalice. His movements weren't angry. Anger would have meant recognition. This was something crueler, something colder. He walked to her booth, stopped just close enough for it to be unmistakable, and tipped the cup. Untipped the cup. The coffee poured like a slow confession over her hands, her coat, her lap, searing, staining, scalding. The gasp that left the room wasn't hers. It came from the diners, the waitress, the old man at the jukebox who turned halfway before freezing in place. Time paused, but not Lorna. Her hands moved methodically, reaching for a napkin as if he'd only spilled a bit of sugar. Her face didn't twist. Her voice, when it finally came, was low and almost tender, like she was addressing a child she pitied. "You're going to regret that," she said. He leaned in, laughing. "A lady, you don't scare me." He said it because he believed it, because he still thought she was alone, because he thought her silence meant she had no teeth. But what Sheriff Hanlon didn't understand, what he would come to learn too late, is that some storms don't come with thunder. Some arrive quiet and steady, wearing gloves and a history. And this one had just begun. Lorna sat soaked, steam rising from her coat and gloves like ghost breath. The coffee had found the tender parts of her skin, her wrists, the soft crease of her lap. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even look down. She took her time, slow and deliberate, as though the act hadn't happened at all. Her right hand, the one he had burned, reached for a stack of paper napkins at the edge of the table. They were cheap, thin things, better suited to blotting syrup than pain, but she used them with quiet precision. She dabbed once at the edge of her glove, then folded the damp square in half, turning it with ritual-like calm. Her movements had the elegance of a pianist, even now, even like this. The diner was frozen, no clatter of forks, no hum of conversation. It was the sound of a reckoning, quiet and unstoppable, blooming inside a woman who had survived fire before. Fire much hotter than coffee and far more dangerous than a man like him. In a sleek Washington, D.C. office layered with strategy maps and national security briefings, Elijah James stood mid-sentence, briefing his team on a high-level operation, when his assistant rushed in, uncharacteristically pale, phone in hand. "Sir, it's your mother." Elijah took the phone without a word. What he saw stopped everything. Grainy diner footage, a white sheriff pouring coffee on a seated black woman. The camera angle was shaky, but he didn't need clarity to recognize her hands, her posture, the way she breathed before speaking. It was Lorna, his mother. The room faded, voices muted. The last time they'd spoken, words had been cold, jagged. Now the silence between them was filled with heat. Not from anger, but from the old ache of a son who never stopped watching her from afar, never stopped loving her beneath the armor he wore. Elijah ended the call, his face unreadable. The team around him stilled. Without explanation, he left the room, phone still playing the video, heart pounding with something older than rage. "B," old calling blood. The jet touched down just after midnight. No sirens, no press. Elijah James stepped onto Millfield soil for the first time in 14 years, not as the director of the FBI, but as a son chasing the echo of something sacred and wounded. He didn't wear his title here. The suit clung to him like skin he'd outgrown. Outgrown. At the edge of the tarmac stood 2 agents in a black SUV waiting to transport him. But his eyes scanned the night, not for danger, for her. For Lorna, The woman who once cradled him through fever and fury, who taught him to read between people's silences. Now the roles were reversed. He came not to command, but to protect, to witness, to repair something that had been fractured long before the world learned her name. By morning, Millfield awoke to an unease. The sleepy streets buzzed with unspoken questions as unfamiliar black SUVs lined the curb outside the sheriff's office. Federal presence was not normal here. Neither was consequence. Whispers followed Elijah's every step as he entered town. Tall, silent, unreadable. The atmosphere shifted. Power for once didn't smell like a bat. Elijah stood before the press with his shoulders square, eyes hidden behind a veil of practiced composure. Cameras clicked like gnats. Microphones jutted forward like bayonets. But his voice remained calm. Too calm. He didn't begin with a list of accomplishments or a summary of charges. He didn't invoke the power of his position. He didn't need to. What he said instead was her name, Lorna James, and in the pause that followed, you could hear the world lean closer. He recounted what the footage showed, an unprovoked act of cruelty, a violation that was both ancient and sickeningly current. But he also spoke of things the cameras didn't capture, of quiet strength, of a woman who had endured the unendurable not for glory, not for attention, but simply because she believed in a gentler way of surviving. His tone never cracked, but his breath caught once, just once, when he said the word mother. For a man who lived in war rooms and intelligence briefings, who made life and death decisions with a flick of his wrist, this moment exposed something rare, not vulnerability, but reverence. Lorna stood beside him, hands clasped, gaze forward. She wore no makeup, no armor. The light grazed the lines of her face. The one sorrow had carved and resilience had etched deeper. She didn't speak during the press conference, not because she had nothing to say, but because some messages don't need to be spoken. Some truths live in silence more powerfully than in any soundbite. The reporters asked questions, urgent, hungry ones, but Elijah cut them off with a gesture so sharp it felt final. She will not be made a spectacle, he said. Not by you, not by anyone. His voice wasn't raised, but its firmness held the room like gravity. The press fell quiet. In the silence that followed, eyes returned to Lorna, and something shifted in those watching, both in the room and across the country. They began to see not just a victim of a hate-fueled humiliation, but the full weight of the woman standing there, the full presence of someone who had lived, who had carried, who had healed, who had healed. What the public didn't know, what they soon learned, was who Lorna James had always been before that diner moment went viral. She wasn't just Elijah's mother. She was a former trauma therapist with over 3 decades of service, most of it in underfunded inner-city clinics, sitting with broken children and battle-worn mothers, listening with the kind of patience that can't be taught. She had worked in silence, in corners, in the margins. The stories she held inside her would crush most people, but she held them not as burdens, but as sacred trusts. For years, she had walked with the wounded and never once demanded applause. Her strength wasn't measured in headlines. It was felt in the quiet rooms where grief made people forget how to breathe. It was in the way she sat beside people while they unraveled and reminded them, gently, again and again, that they could come back from the darkness. And yet in Millfield, she had been invisible, not because she hid, but because the town had chosen not to see her. They saw her skin before her credentials, her silence before her story. They saw what they were conditioned to dismiss, a quiet black woman with no need to prove herself. In their world, that kind of dignity was threatening, but the world watching now was different. Thousands shared the footage. Millions watched her stand beside the most powerful law enforcement official in the country, not as a token, not as a spectacle, but as a reckoning. And as the facts of her life surfaced, so too did the weight of what it meant to be her. Social workers wrote in, Former patients found her name and shared how she'd saved them without ever asking for anything in return. A woman from Chicago posted that Lorna had held her hand after a miscarriage, saying nothing, just breathing with her until the sobs eased. A man from Detroit wrote that Lorna was the reason he didn't kill himself in 1998. People began to understand. She had already changed the world long before a sheriff's cruelty made her a headline. But it wasn't the testimonials that changed the tide. It was the contrast. The man who poured hot coffee on her represented the old America, loud, smug, weaponized by authority. Lorna represented something older, deeper, and infinitely more enduring. The America that endures quietly, refuses to harden, and survives in silence because shouting would be too much like them. And now she was being seen, not because she asked to be, not because she demanded her moment, but because the world finally looked up and couldn't look away. Sheriff Matt Hanlon had grown up believing he was untouchable. His father had patrolled these streets with a grin and a gun long before him, and the town had always nodded along. No matter how many times he bent the rules, no matter how many complaints were filed and quietly buried, the badge shielded him. It wasn't just metal pinned to his chest, it was armor made from silence, from complicity, from history. He didn't think of himself as a racist. He didn't have to think, he simply was. And in Millfield, that had always been enough. Until now, the calls started the day after the footage went viral. Not from his usual contacts, not from the mayor or the old guard at the town council. These were calls from DC cold, clipped, and without any trace of the deference he was used to. Internal affairs, civil rights division, federal oversight. And worse than the calls were the eyes. 40 eyes. The people in town who used to smile with him now avoided him, some out of guilt, some out of fear. A few out of quiet, long-held satisfaction. The aura he had carried, the myth of invincibility, had ruptured. It leaked around the edges of every interaction. The waitress who once greeted him with warmth now placed his coffee on the table like it might burn her instead. At first, he doubled down, told himself the whole thing was blown out of proportion, that she had sat there, arrogant, silent, and asking for a lesson in humility, that people didn't understand the pressure of being the law in a town like this, that his father wouldn't have apologized either. But no one was listening to those justifications anymore. The town didn't care what made him snap. They only saw what he did, and the rest of the country saw it too. The indictment came fast than he expected. 1 count of battery. 1 count of civil rights violation under color of law. Federal jurisdiction. No option to tuck it under the rug. No friendly judge to call in favors. The courtroom was filled with unfamiliar faces when the arraignment came. Not the loyal townspeople who used to shake his hand at Sunday service. These were journalists, civil rights lawyers, quiet observers. Lorna sat in the back row, wearing the same calm she had worn the day he tried to humiliate her. Her presence undid him. Not because she spoke, she never said a word. But she watched, and he could feel it. In his spine, in his throat. It was like she held a mirror before him, and for the first time in his life, he had to see himself. He fumbled through his statements. His lawyer tried to spin the narrative. Heat of the moment, no malice, community service record. But it all fell flat. There was no defense against the quiet truth. No shield against a nation that had turned its eyes toward this case, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. And then came the community reckoning. At town halls, people began to speak, not just about Sheriff Hanlon, but about what they had endured. A black schoolteacher stepped forward, voice shaking, recounting how Hanlon once pulled her over and made her sit on the curb for 40 minutes while he checked her registration. A teenager stood beside her and described how his older brother was dragged from a car for talking back. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about the years of rot that had festered under the weight of fear and silence. Lorna never spoke at those meetings. She sat in the second row, always listening, always still. But her silence now had a different power. It was no longer invisible. It was the pulse behind the confessions, the anchor for the unraveling truth. The town couldn't ignore her anymore. And in some strange way, neither could Matt. For the first time in his life, he realized the badge wasn't the heaviest thing he wore. Shame was. Clung to him like smoke, thick and choking, following him everywhere. And there was no way to wash it off. He tried to avoid her, but every path led back to Lorna James. Not because she hunted him, but because she haunted him. Not with vengeance, but with something far more devastating. Grace. She had offered no revenge, no public condemnation. She had offered dignity, and it ruined him, because he realized, in the deepest pit of his being, that she had always been more than he ever allowed himself to see. He had poured boiling coffee on a woman who had healed more people than he had ever protected. The hospital room was warm, with sunlight and quiet hums of machinery. Lorna sat beside Elijah's bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, steady and slow, like tides she once watched from the porch of their first apartment. 2 nights prior, exhaustion, doctors said, though she knew better. It wasn't just fatigue, it was the weight, the burden of power, legacy, guilt. He had come back for her, but he had also returned to the place that first taught him to hide his softness behind steel. Now he lay there, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen since he was 7 years old, and fevered with pneumonia, shivering and mumbling stories about space travel in his sleep. She reached for his hand, long, calloused, clenched even in unconsciousness, and wrapped hers around it. It amazed her sometimes how much of him still belonged to that frightened little boy. She whispered his name the way only a mother can, not loud, not urgent, just enough to call him back. His fingers twitched, a breath shifted, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, not as the director, not as the man on the news, but as a son waking into the presence of the only person who had ever known his full, unbroken truth. He tried to speak, but she shook her head, tears finally sliding down her cheek, the kind she had held back for years. No words were needed. In that silence, he understood. He had not come to save her. She had always been saving him. A week later, Lorna stood before a crowd not gathered to protest, but to listen. They filled the church hall, a sea of faces once unfamiliar, but now changed. Some by guilt, others by awakening. She held a worn notebook in her hands, its spine cracked, filled with the names of every patient she had ever walked with in silence. "You're not here," she began, "because a man poured coffee. We are here because, for too long, pain like mine has been expected to endure quietly." Her voice didn't tremble. It rang like a bell. Low, sure, mournful. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Dignity is not silence. The crowd leaned in, moved not just by her story, but by the grace with which she carried it. She spoke of wounds passed down through generations, of small humiliations and large betrayals, of the way women like her became invisible in plain sight. But she did not accuse. She remembered. She invited. She transformed grief into invitation. And when she closed her notebook, the room did not erupt in applause. It stood silently, in reverence, in sorrow, in shared responsibility. And something old began to crack. Not just in Millfield, but in the bones of everyone who finally chose to listen. The sheriff's badge was turned in without ceremony. No cameras, no applause, just a plain envelope handed over at the county office, his name scratched off the placard an hour later. Outside, a group of children walked past the building, laughing, unaware of the weight that had just shifted. Inside, Matt Hanlon lingered for a moment longer, staring at the desk where he'd once sat with so much pride. There was no redemption arc waiting for him, only the long, cold understanding that power had never made him a man, and that losing it might finally force him to become one. Lorna sat in her kitchen at dusk, the same table where she once helped Elijah with fractions, where she cried alone after losing her husband, where she had learned how to become her own peace. Now, the house was filled with voices again, neighbors, youth counselors, even strangers, drawn not by obligation, but by something more sacred, witness. Her silence had once been a shield. Now, it was a foundation. What was broken in public had begun to heal in community. The library auditorium was filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs creaked beneath the weight of bodies and stories, and yet the crowd spilled out into the hallway, some standing for hours just to be present. On the stage sat Lorna, framed not by lights or spectacle, but by the warmth of elders, poets, students, and single mothers who had flown in from other states just to touch her hand, just to say thank you. The town had asked her to speak again, this time not as a victim, not even as the mother of Lorna James, but as Lorna, the woman who bore witness and stood still until the world changed shape around her. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need to. When she spoke, it was as if the walls themselves were listening. She spoke of memory, the kind that clings to generations, the kind that stains even a quiet cup of coffee. She spoke of mercy, not as pardon, but as clarity, a holy refusal to carry what does not belong to you. And when a young girl in the front row asked her how she stayed so calm, Lorna leaned forward and whispered, "Because I remember who raised me, and I remember who I raised." Elijah stood near the back, arms crossed not in resistance but in awe. It had been months since that day in Millfield. The investigation had ended, the sheriff resigned, policies had changed, but none of that moved him like this, watching her in this moment, not behind glass, not under headlines, but among her people. She was not an icon. She was a mother who never gave up on her son, a healer who kept her hands open even after the world tried to close them. His phone buzzed with messages, speaking invitations, interviews, security briefings, but he didn't answer. He watched her move through the crowd after the talk, hugging each person who stepped forward like they were hers. Because in a way, they were. Every life she touched, every person who broke open in her presence, was part of a quiet revolution that didn't need sirens to be heard. Lorna never chased justice. She made space for it. And in that space, her son, once hardened by power, once lost in the machinery of politics, found something more enduring than authority. He found home. Thank you for witnessing this story, not just with your ears, but with your soul. What you've just experienced isn't fiction. It's the truth so many live but few dare to speak. A woman silenced by cruelty became the voice of a generation. A mother's quiet strength dismantled the illusion of power. And in her stillness, a nation trembled, then listened. If your chest feels tight, if your eyes burn a little, that's not pain, that's recognition. That's the moment you realize the world doesn't change by noise alone. It changes when dignity stands unshaken in the face of hate. This was not a story about what happened. It was a story about what must never happen again. You felt something tonight. Don't let it fade. Share this. Speak of it. Carry her silence like a torch. And stay with us, because at A1 Storyteller, we don't just tell stories, we resurrect truth. And the next one might just be yours.